Back during the early days of 2.0, once a player caught up with the MSQ, there really wasn't much else to do. There were no alliance raids or massive, tedious Realm Reborn patches to get through. There weren't even PvP housing really much of anything. The only options for in-game content were running the now reviled Praetorium and Castrum Meridianum, running the Binding Coils of Bahamut raid, the first tier of which is divisive in its own right, getting geared up for coils by running one of the two endgame dungeons, Amdapor Keep, and this dungeon, Wanderer's Palace. So, as one of the two dungeons that people would grind for gear drops, how did it turn out? Well, as you can see, we're in F tier, so not that well. However, we're also at the top of F tier, so it actually wasn't that bad. Well, it's still bad, but it's the least bad of all the F tier dungeons. One thing to talk about before we get into the breakdown is the plot and aesthetics for Palace. I'll normally save this for later in the video, but for this one I'm going to make an exception. The plot for Wanderer's Palace is actually pretty interesting since it deals heavily with a stable Final Fantasy race. Tonberries are present in almost every Final Fantasy game, and their 14 incarnations are particularly interesting. They are the mutated citizens of the ancient city of Nim after a plague showed up and warped them into hate-filled and incredibly cute green fish-like abominations. Their story is explored more in the Scholar questline, but we're not here for that, so go play it if you want to learn more. Essentially, the main reason that they're incredibly angry is because their king is influencing them all into being murderous little shits. The party's job is to bonk the king and free the Tonberries from being angry all the time. The aesthetic of the dungeon is unremarkable, I'd say. It's not another fucking underground dungeon, but its aesthetic is underwhelming for something that the game describes as a palace of unparalleled beauty. There's really not much to say on it other than there's a lot of hallways and machinery, which, I don't know, is kind of interesting. I don't know, it just never really popped out in my mind as being something more than just a generic dungeon. So the story is decent due to some greater lore surrounding the location, but the aesthetics of the dungeon itself are more like white noise than actually interesting design. So what about the gameplay? The first trash area introduces one of the elements of the dungeon that's indicative of the entire experience. See, many of the trash pulls take place in long hallways, which is how 14 normally builds its dungeons. However, there's a twist here. After a bit of time, a giant Tonberry will spawn at the end of the hallways. It slowly approaches the party while wielding a giant fucking knife. It's incredibly menacing and sets a time limit on how fast the party needs to burn down the trash. If they go too slow, the big Tonberry catches up and starts taking people out one by one until there's no one left but a tank desperately trying to stay alive until... Except, that's not how it goes. What really happens is... This is going to be a common theme in this dungeon, so strap in. At the gear levels that most people run this dungeon at, the big intimidating stab of doom doesn't even kill. Hell, it barely makes a dent in the squishiest health bar. And that's assuming the Tonberry even reaches the party. DPS is so high now that you'll be clearing the trash well before the Tonberry cosplaying Michael Myers even manages to round the first corner. Okay, here's the first boss. There's nothing to this one. Just don't stand in AoE and dispel anything that gets slapped onto players. Except you probably don't even have to do that since the poison stacks don't do shit for damage and the healing down stack is probably irrelevant since the boss dies before you need to throw out more than a single heal. Ah, but the disappointing Stalker Tonberry is only one of two awful mechanics this dungeon gives us. The next is...
just lube it up.
See, smaller Tonberries will drop oil that you need to use on rusty mechanisms to open doors around the dungeon. This, does fucking nothing for the dungeon, except make it take longer. This is a trend that I absolutely despise in 14. Having keys drop to open the gate that is right in front of the player instead of, say, having the gate open when all the ads are cleared out is incredibly annoying. I know it's likely just a product of the time before the dev team knew how to work the engine properly in order to make gates open on their own without needing the players to interact with a special thing. But it's still here, and I hate it. There's no greater context for things being added in here. There's no better understanding of lore implications or anything like that. It's just insert oil into machine, move on. It might as well be a cast bar saying, wait this long to progress. I know I'm harping on for a while on something that's basically 10 seconds of waiting, but you'll see why this is a big issue when you get into the next room. This area is the biggest reason why this dungeon has landed itself in F tier. This is an absolutely massive room with 4 lube spots. You have to find and kill enough small Tonberries to get the oil, then you need to search the entire absurdly big room for the machines. This is a massive waste of time and incredibly tedious. One of the best things that 14 does in its dungeon design is linearity. This is another video that I want to do one of these days, but to summarize it, MMOs are all about efficiency. No matter what you do, there's going to be people who will want to do it as quickly and efficiently as possible. So while big open segments of dungeons are a neat idea, they almost always wind up doing more harm than good in dungeon design, since MMO dungeons are designed to be played on repeat, so having them be a straightforward series of challenges that can't be skipped or subverted ensures that runs will be consistent. This is why we see dungeons in 14 swiftly lose their sprawling open design in favor of linear corridors that just have the extra loot set up along them. It's easier to make, and running them is significantly smoother. Yeah, you lose a sense of exploration by removing larger areas, but the point of MMO dungeons isn't to explore, it's to clear it as fast as possible. 14's style of MMO is often called a theme park MMO, and this design shares a lot with theme park ride design. That's a whole other topic, and I've already spent too long on this already, so I'll sum this up with a simple, this section is bad and clunky, please help me get through it as fast as possible. Oh, and before I forget, the one mechanism in the middle of the area doesn't actually need oil to turn. You just need to right-click it. I've had an ungodly number of groups forget that, me included, and spend like 5 to 10 minutes running around looking for the last Tonberry that doesn't exist. Because apparently, having consistency in your dungeon design is for scrubs. Anyway, let's move on to the second boss, who dies almost instantly and its attacks do negligible damage. If you're even moderately geared, this fight will be over before you even register it as beginning. The last trash phase is a significantly shorter time on the Michael Myers Tonberry, but as we've discussed, this doesn't really matter. Burn everything down and move on to the only boss with a pulse in this place. See, on paper, the Tonberry King is actually a pretty cool fight. The main mechanic mirrors that of a lot of Tonberries in Final Fantasy. The boss gains a stack of rancor every time a Tonberry ad dies. After some time, he'll cast everyone's grudge, drawing on the unfettered rage of his fallen subjects to deal massive damage to the tank. This will cleanse all of his stacks of rancor, but deal a ton of damage depending on how many ads have been killed. So you can't just kill all the ads or he'll one-shot the tank. But you can't leave them alone because their damage will overwhelm the tank if they're ignored for too long. This creates a delicate balancing act, where you need to ensure you're only killing the right amount of ads to survive the grudge. Towards the end, he'll spawn a group of unsubtly named Tonberry slashers that slowly move in from the edges of the room. If a player aggroes them, they deal an absurd amount of damage and pretty much just one-shot them. So the players are put on a timer as the menacing Tonberries slowly shuffle closer and closer, just like how they do in the other FF games. Excellent ideas, and I'd love to show you footage from some of them. However, I can't do that because in any run you do, you just burn the boss down in a minute flat and not care about any of that shit. All in all, Wanderer's Palace is almost D tier. It's got some good ideas that just don't come into play anymore, but the thing that keeps it down here in F tier is that clinching factor of annoyance. The second trash area is just plain annoying, and if all the oil bits were cut out, this would easily be a bottom D tier dungeon. But the oil is still there and still stupid. Aside from that, the biggest problem with the dungeon is that it's just old. Not just because it's an ancient civilization buried beneath the waves being explored for the first time since the calamity that sealed it away, but because the mechanics are just completely gone. You'll note that I didn't bring up the oil mechanic in the third trash phase, because there it's actually an effective tension builder when the Michael Myers Tonberries are bearing down on the party and they just need to get the door open, oh god! But as we've discussed, those menacing stalkers along with this entire dungeon really have lost too much of their sting. If any dungeon deserves the title of obliterated by the passage of time, it's this one. Everything feels dated, like you're walking through somewhere that was once an interesting, intense experience, but now is just faded to a bare shadow of itself. Really, that's what a lot of the F-tier dungeons feel like. Dated relics of a time gone by. Remnants from an earlier age when the design of the game was still up in the air and things were less formed, less refined than they are now. And you know what the roughest thing of them all is? We're just standing at the top of the trash pile. This is the best dungeon in F tier. The only reason it's not deeper in is because the dungeons below it are just truly rancid. But we're gonna forge ahead and see what they've got, because you can only really appreciate quality when you've experienced the absolute trash that came before it. So thank you for watching, and I do hope you'll come with me to explore the trash below this dungeon before we start climbing the ladder out of the trash and rise to the truly incredible content that has inspired me to make these videos. Remember to do all the typical YouTube stuff, and I hope to see you next time. Have a good one, and remember to always forge ahead.